The Weeknd's House of Balloons will turn 10 years old on March 21st, and much like its alt R&B contemporaries, HOB is still a worthy revisit not just because it aged like the finest drug reference and profanity-laced wine on the planet, but also because it succinctly showcases the Weeknd's ability to be an avatar right at the infancy of his career. Just to make it clear, we're talking less about the blue people with USB cords for tails, and more of that bald kid with the blue arrow tats. Yeah, we're fans.
Water. Hose. Super hot fuck.
We say this not because we think the Weeknd can summon wind balls out of thin air and boulders out of the ground. We say this because of the way that Abel and his team are able to utilize usually mismatched elements from multiple inspirations and genres and blend them into one single track with relative slickness and effortlessness. I don't know about you, but that deserves a ton of credit for being an act so shrouded in secrecy. Some folks thought this man was a whole ass band. This innate ability we've seen for most of his repertoire, which we will refer to as his avatar style, was the first thing that I could recall about HOB moments after the eureka of revisiting the mixtape hatched onto my head. Today we take a trip down memory lane over the Weeknd's 10-year-old slobber knocker of a debut project and establish the case over why the 31-year-old megastar is both an element-bending avatar and probably one of the most influential artists of our generation. Before that, I just want to say that because we enjoyed revisiting Frank Ocean's Nostalgia Ultra so much in the last video, we were inspired to consider that video as the pilot episode to Dygest's first ever video series called Revisited. The series will, as the name suggests, revisit noteworthy projects released in the same month from 5 years ago or more. Basically, we'll be feeding off your nostalgia. Thank you. Because it's 2021, we're inclined to pick decade-old projects from the star-studded year that was 2011. Currently, we're between these three juggernaut projects to revisit for April, and we'll probably put the chosen one to a vote over our Instagram and Twitter pages very soon. So do keep your eyes peeled for that poll, and perhaps follow us over there as well. But since we know you guys can sniff out other great releases from the same month, feel free to comment or hit us a DM over what you feel is a noteworthy project to revisit. So yeah, without further ado, let's go back to the Weeknd. Before we talk about him though, I thought it would be important to examine who I consider to be music's very first avatar, fellow R&B crooner Michael Jackson. For some of you whippersnappers out there who only knew the king of pop from his condemning controversies, many of us remember him as an absolute hit machine from his time, churning out classics since he was just 8 freaking years old. His ascension to becoming the first avatar in my opinion would be with the release of the groundbreaking Halloween quintessential and 80s greatest hit staple Thriller in 1984. While I may be wrong, I am of the impression that the 1984 classic was actually one of the first songs, at least with regards to catchy disco music, to successfully incorporate darker themes of fear and spook into a song and make it box office. Although Jackson's contribution to the song was undeniable, I thought it right to give just as much credit to the track's songwriter Rod Temperton and MJ's top producer Quincy Jones for the stellar development of this hit. Once I gave it a re-listen, yeah, in hindsight, this 37-year-old classic does have a zany element of relative novelty to it. And as it's aging, it's definitely sounding more cartoonish and campy, and perhaps I can blame my cynical millennial mind for this, but I also think that this corniness was key to it becoming a bona fide hit because it utilized the themes of werewolves through both the song and its equally iconic music video in such an accessible and alluring way that most listeners can't help but be pleasantly spooked whenever they hear those memorable wolf sounds and deep-cutting synths. But alas, MJ's tendencies to take horror as an inspiration would be constricted to just a handful of tracks such as Ghosts and Is It Scary. Other than that, Michael is pretty much Michael. Fast forward to 2011, and we have a relative up-and-comer take a completely radical angle from how MJ incorporated out-of-the-box themes in pop/R&B/disco music and break the barriers that Thriller was once confined to, birthing the now hotly contested genre of alternative R&B. How did the King of the Fall succeed in this? Let's head over to the facts. Out of HOB's 10 tracks, 8 of them featured samples from a variety of who's who's from indie to dream pop, ranging from Yuichi Sakamoto to Susie and the Banshees. Immediately, we see a standout from the rest of the hive of R&B acts of the time who preferred to take samples from the inside of R&B or pop music. Although the number of samples would pale in comparison to HOB's contemporary Nostalgia Ultra at 13, the way the Weeknd samples, in my opinion, will be much more potent and effective, pound for pound. The Party and the After Party, for example, samples Beach House's Master of None, turning the already dreamy, psychedelic aura of instrumentals a couple notches up by hiking up the BPM and the pitch, while adding up a little touch of reverb, which would become sort of a staple for the Weeknd's music for a long while. This stylistic choice for me is a snapshot that captures the overall theme of the mixtape, all while telling this dark tale of an ill-fated relationship that began in one of the Weeknd's drug/sex-filled parties. Victoria Legrand's vocals couldn't have had a better fit into this song, being interpolated as a spectre-like, phoned-in chorus that almost sounds like a 50s cabaret sample if you weren't aware of the Beach House original in the first place. Second track, What You Need, took a single quotable from Malia's Rock the Boat and turned it into one of the most memorable song intros of the entire trilogy compilation. This temptress of a 3-minute track, along with first track High for This, would also be noteworthy in setting the mixtape's atmosphere of mystique and sinfulness, but this time through more dragged out, moody instrumentals sprinkled with higher pitched, tense-filled keys that almost feel like an intense thriller film score. I think both were definitively good choices for being the tracks that would have introduced many would-be fans to not just The Weeknd, but to his signature, bright center vocals as well. By the way, the vocals in this mixtape for some reason feel a little more special in comparison to the more polished iterations of his voice in future releases. I don't know about you, but it just sounds a little more mesmerizing and hypnotic to me. Maybe, possibly, probably due in part to The Weeknd's anonymity at the time, but more so to the singing's slower, more soulful progression and unabashed rawness that I would attribute from the mixing, which really leaves Abel Tesfaye's To Die For vocals here, bare and naked for the whole world to hear. Another aspect of The Weeknd's style that the world will be introduced to here is Abel's crafty ability to provide a second voice for himself. They almost sound like rapper ad-libs in terms of how potently they bring out Abel's character and personality, as well as reinforcing the undertones of whatever song they're in. This could not be more prevalent in the mixtape style track and fan favorite House of Balloons/Glass Table Girls, where The Weeknd would just go ballistic in serving us this sample platter of the various ways he can use that throat to make amazing sounds. Wink wink. Apart from the vocals in the verses and the cold-ass rapping in the second half, the chorus of this song would be just the single most unforgettable utterance of this album. Perhaps Abel's most iconic ever. I mean, my god, this would be the first of many tracks in the future where he would pull out this piece de resistance, signature Gregorian chant singing style in the part of "This is a happy house, we're happy here, in this happy house. Oh, this is..."
I wanna say I'm sorry.
I found this oddly catchy and uplifting, despite being a double down at the same time of the eerie factor of the song. The first time you hear that, and you'll get why so many fans marked out when he decided to include the song in his Super Bowl performance. Another thing about this song is that it actually has this short and sweet beat switch that I would say is just a couple threads below par with the beat switches of Travis Scott's Sicko Mode or Frank Ocean's Nights, in terms of how effective it is in teleporting you from one dragged out move to another. Infidelity anthem Wicked Games is the mixtape's first single, and while I'd argue that there would have definitely been stronger nominees for the single of this mixtape, it did serve its purpose in showcasing The Weeknd's vocals in this sultry, melodramatic bop, while once again embodying the stylistic choices of the mixtape. The Morning is a song that some critics consider to be uneventful for its lyrics and performances. And while I could empathize with that perspective, I would also argue that this song, along with The Party and The After Party, were successful in being this sort of palate cleanser from the more heavy, sinister bangers of the previous tracks, while still maintaining the ethereal atmosphere. Sure, the lyrics aren't Shakespearean, but if the song's only purpose is to portray the hazy, hangover-induced headspace you get the morning after a raunchy night of partying and sex, does complexity even matter? I know I didn't try to decipher the lyrics in my first listen. I didn't have to. It's just a solid jam. So solid that this was the song that Abel would choose to perform in his cameo for the movie Uncut Gems. Unsolicited tip, please go watch that movie. Just awesome. Coming Down and Loft Music are the mixtape's relative weak points, being that they're still decent, but ultimately derivative anthems of The Weeknd's vices presented in just different creative influences. 28 is this interesting, gripping dramatic ballad that caps off the mixtape and complements the penultimate track, The Knowing, really well. These tracks were what really excited me for future releases, being that those songs touch and expand upon the seeping but still veiled vulnerability of Abel, which would only be busted wide open 7 years later in My Dear Melancholy. I would attribute the beginning of The Weeknd's comparisons to MJ to this track due to the fact that Abel just really sings his heart out here, flexing his range, his timbre, basically his whole skill set to the farthest extent. It's safe to say that HOB would be the peak of The Weeknd's innovations, at least until the arrival of maybe Starboy or After Hours, as Abel's work would shift towards more radio-friendly projects that still maintain the dark twist in BBTM and Kissland. Many have classified HOB as an experimental piece. I attribute this again to the feverish craze caused by Abel's then anonymity, as well as the almost vomit-inducing saturation of stagnant, conventional bubblegum pop-inspired R&B, at the time. But I would refrain from putting HOB in that box. Abel's defiance is nothing but natural, despite it seeming experimental. Every single deviance in this mixtape just managed to sound so well calculated and coherent, despite being a completely new sound altogether, that I found it incomparable to any other R&B project that just tried to experiment. It came as no surprise to me that the mixtape would slowly end up being an omnipresent influence to a whole generation of artists, both in and out of R&B, through the years. Even legends like Usher couldn't help but take inspiration from the fledgling mixtape and his 2012 single Climax, which Abel would note later in the 2020 interview was a point of realization of his clear greatness. Young Abel didn't know it at the time, but he would end up launching R&B into a completely different stratosphere with just a debut mixtape alone. Lord knows what he would do next, right? I don't want to put out this idea that either MJ or The Weeknd would have benefited from shifting their polarizing styles toward each other. One, it would just be physically impossible, but what I will say is that the exact difference between them is that The Weeknd didn't try to coddle or censor his listeners from the darker side of his music's themes. MJ did the opposite in presenting fright under a friendly facade, and that's okay. But The Weeknd seduced us into a hellish heaven and made us pay to stay. Perhaps The Weeknd's bold risks were merely a product of having nothing to lose and everything to gain at the same time. But what is undoubtable is the ungodly success it brought him. While I do believe that MJ still rightfully deserves the title of the King of Pop, Thank you for watching. We are Dygest, the storytellers of music. Please subscribe and leave a like, and let us know where we're revisiting next.